Hey everyone! To continue with our presentation on underground music in communist Czechoslovakia, I will be talking about the content and style of underground Czech bands and how they were influenced by the popular and underground music of the Western world, specifically the UK and the US. So I'm going to be discussing three major groups that arose early on in the underground scene and formed the foundation of the Czech underground. And we may have already talked about these, or we may talk about some of them in future presentations too. These three groups are Plastic People of the Universe, Psi Vojáci, and Zubiněci, and they were heavily inspired by Western punk and rock. Their interpretation of these genres further inspired Czech musicians in later years, and led to the development of the underground scene as a cohesive musical moment in Czech culture. So the first band that we'll talk about is Plastic People in the Universe, which was founded in 1968 by bass player Mela Hlavsa. Originally, the band started out as a psychedelic rock group with lots of different musicians circulating in and out over the years. Their early work was very avant-garde, with diverse instrumentation including classical strings, woodwind, and brass instruments, alongside the regular guitar, keyboard, and bass. Their performances were also very theatrical, incorporating costumes, props, and lighting, with the help of their creative director, Magor Jiros. The early work of the Plastic People was actually not really intended to be political. Instead, they were simply inspired by the work of Western bands like Frank Zappa, the Beatles, and especially the Velvet Underground, and they wanted to bring a similar sound to Czechoslovakia. The Velvet Underground is particularly notable for their role in the formation of the underground scene in New York City.
But I know that I'm going trying to get my life, 'cause when the blood begins to flow, when it shoots up the dropper's neck, when I'm closing in on death,
their dark, intense sound and lyrics that reflected on experiences of sex, drugs, and the emerging culture of gender nonconformity heavily influenced the Plastic People in the establishment of their sound and image as a band. The work of the Plastic People didn't really take on a political turn until after several members of the band were put on trial and arrested in the mid-70s. When they were released, they were forbidden to play in public, and so that's when they started making more music that overtly criticized the regime. Their album, Egon Bundy's Happy Hearts Club Band, obviously a reference to the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, put the poetry of underground writer Egon Bundy to music and was very critical of the regime. Also, their song, Sto Bodů, or 100 Points, lists 100 things the regime is afraid of in repetitive trance-like lines over a droning guitar and aggressive improvisation in the strings and winds. The lyrics of the clip that you just heard roughly translate to, "They are afraid of Marx, they are afraid of Lenin, they are afraid of all of our dead presidents. They are afraid of truth, they are afraid of freedom, they are afraid of democracy, they are afraid of the Human Rights Charter," meaning Charter 77. "They are afraid of socialism, so why the hell are we afraid of them?" Sto Bodů is a perfect example of the Western influence on Czech underground music because it combines the sounds of bands like the Velvet Underground but still retains its distinctly culturally Czech origin. Without the pressure to conform in a capitalist market, the song drones on for 15 minutes, and the sound might seem harsh compared to Western music at the time. But the sonic contrast between the repetitive rhythms and bold improvisation perfectly encapsulates the dynamic between the strict communist regime and the underground's desire for individuality and experimentation with their music, a dynamic that the Plastic People of the Universe continually work to break. So the next band that we'll talk about is called Psi Vojáci, which translates to dog soldiers and refers to a depiction of the Cheyenne nations in satirical American Western novel Little Big Man. Arriving a little bit later on the scene, Psy was formed in 1978 by then 13-year-old Philippe Topol and a few of his schoolmates. They started out by opening for larger, more established bands like Plastic People, at underground events spread by word of mouth and at private concerts, such as the shows that Václav Havel often held in his own home. Despite their attempts to avoid authorities, Topol was interrogated and banned from performing very early on in his music career. Because he was only 14 at the time, he didn't have identification, and his own mother had to accompany him to his interrogation. Unlike the Plastic People of the universe, Psy always dealt with overtly political themes, both in lyrics and in sound. Topol draws on the intensity of 18th century Romanticism with his sweeping piano melodies, but his harsh vocals over layered guitar, bass, and percussion form a distinctly punk sound. Topol was also known for his dramatic, fiery performances, during which he was said to play piano until his fingers bled.
Kouše kozla, hudba scéna, nevěstřená, uloupená, téhle noci kosel, ve řídí, tiše trpí, vítřek akord není duní, buší, zkučí, větší tví, hudba hladí, kope, škrtí, rytmus dupe, reverzí,
The group's lyrics, written by Topol's brother, a prominent underground poet, explored incredibly dark themes, incorporating imagery such as death and violence. It was a little bit difficult to find direct official translations for a lot of their music, so the translation of the first verse of their song, Byla a studena, which I'll read, is a little bit rough, and I'm not exactly sure if it's completely 100% accurate.
Byla studena, přišla mi říct, že všechny moje, nejde mi příští, že všechny moje, nejde mi příští, nás vezmou k čertu a až se kleknem, hlavou proti větru, přijde k nám smrt, přijde k nám smrt.
The first verse of their song, Byla a studena, which means white and cold, translates roughly to this: white and cold, she came to tell me that all my future parties will take us to hell, and when we kneel down, our heads against the wind, death will come to us. Psy took inspiration from British and American punk music of the mid to late 70s, drawing on the severe sounds and politically cynical lyrics. The early work of American punk band The Ramones, along with British groups The Clash and the Sex Pistols, had a huge impact on the development of Topol's dark sound. Drawing on the sound of Western punk and Topol's own experiences under the communist regime, Psy created a completely unique brand of underground Czech punk. So the final band that we'll talk about is Zuby Nechty, and for this band we actually got to interview one of the members, Pavla Janssonova. So we got to hear her input on their inspiration and what led them to develop their sound. Like Psy, Zuby Nechty formed a bit later in 1980 as a group of 4 friends that were looking to make music together. The members of Zuby Nechty, meaning tooth and nail, didn't really have political intentions with their music. They just wanted to create art as a commentary on the reality of life. Pavla explained in her interview that she was not concerned with creating music that overtly criticized the regime, but at the same time, they didn't want to force themselves into writing about the romantic, sentimental topics that were expected of them as an all-female group at the time. Despite their focus on the personal rather than the political, Zuby Nechty was blacklisted from performing in public as the state determined their lyrics were too dark and pessimistic, particularly for an all-female group. After their ban, they continued to perform in underground and private venues throughout the 80s.
Ráno potkám toho, co říká sprostá slova. Text něho čiší, ale čertovem. K čemu vážná slova na to, co se děje? Trochu mě to mrzí, ale čertovem.
When writing their music, Pavla said that she and her friends were inspired by a wide range of Western Underground groups, including the already mentioned Velvet Underground and the Ramones. Perhaps most influential was the work of Patti Smith, a songwriter living in New York known for her striking poetic lyrics and captivating stage presence.
Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. Oh, the man out of thieves that walk out my sleeve, and the goddess don't own my sin, my own. It belongs to me, to me.
As an all-female punk group, Zubi Nehti admired Smith's ability to stand out among the male-dominated underground scene in New York, as well as her androgynous image that rejected societal conceptions of female musicians. Although Zubi Nehti did not seek to make an explicitly political statement, they used their gritty, candid lyrics, punk rock sound, and tough image to subvert expectations of female artists in Czechoslovakia at the time. Like the Plastic People and Psi Vojáci, Zubi Nehti experimented with different instruments and techniques to create an original sound. Their loud, fast-paced percussion and heavy guitar certainly draw from Western underground music, but their use of raw, unstructured improvisation and frantic vocals separated them from any of their predecessors. From looking at these three groups, we can see that the influence of Western underground punk and rock music had a huge impact on the sound and style of Czech bands. The Plastic People of the Universe, Psi Vojáci, and Zubi Nehti, all key players in the development of Czech underground music, were heavily inspired by early American and British punk and rock musicians. They were able to reimagine the sound of these groups from across the world, but in a distinctly Czech way. The cultural context of their music during the later 20th century is particularly important because it allowed Czech underground music to evolve in a certain way. The creation and performance of underground music were themselves acts of resistance to the regime. Along with that aspect of their work, underground musicians also rejected the ideals of the regime through the sound and the content of their music, and through their image and self-representation, often embracing an androgynous or alternative look. In the absence of a capitalist market for their music, Czech artists were also able to experiment with a wider range of instruments and make use of improvisation in inventive ways, as their music was not made to appeal to a consumer, but rather to express their own musical point of view. In addition, many of the musicians were quite young, or did not have a lot of experience, but were accepted as part of the movement regardless. As Pavla explained in our interview, underground music was more about the feeling of community and performance, and the unity of Czech people against the oppressive regime, than it was about the particular sound itself. In this way, Czech underground music remains a critically important genre in the historical narrative of resistance to the communist regime.